Hello, my name's Rory. If you don't know who I am, I'm one of the circuit ministers. I'm based in Haxby and Wigginton. And I'm just offering online this week a reflection, a sermon around one of the readings. We are into the second week of Lent. And one of the alternate readings of the Gospel this week is the Transfiguration in Luke, which we actually had as a reading a couple of weeks ago on Transfiguration Sunday. Because we have the Transfiguration potentially this Sunday as well, I want to take a little bit of license and go back 2 weeks to the other New Testament lesson that was set for that day, which is from 2 Corinthians chapter 3. So I'm going to read that and then share some thoughts with you on that, which you can then use in worship as you see fit as you gather. Paul writes, "Since then we have such a hope, we act with great boldness, not like Moses, who put a veil over his face to keep the people of Israel from gazing at the end of the glory that was being set aside. But their minds were hardened. Indeed, to this very day, when they hear the reading of the Old Covenant, that same veil is still there, since only in Christ is it set aside. Indeed, to this very day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their minds. But when one turns to the Lord, the veil is removed. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And all of us, with unveiled faces, seeing the glory of the Lord as though reflected in a mirror, are being transformed into the same image, from one degree of glory to another, for this comes from the Lord, the Spirit." Last week on Wednesday, I made my cup of tea as I do in the morning, and I went and sat outside. It's light enough in the morning now, I get up quite early, that I can go and sit outside. We have a bench just outside the door, and it faces west, and along the side of our manse on the road there is a large hedge. And every morning in the spring, well, pretty much right through the year, there is a very loud gaggle of sparrows who gather in the hedge. Either one family having the most raucous, joyful breakfast, or two families having a great fight, we're not sure which. But our garden is alive, and the sun is coming up behind and around the side of the house, and the air is fresh. My son Matt, who's 16, decided he'd come and sit with me. He'd had his breakfast and his coffee, and the two of us sat together on the bench, just as the war in Ukraine had begun, reflecting on the ease with which we jump into very binary ideas of who's right and wrong and good and bad. And though in this case it's not hard to discern that the actions of Vladimir Putin and the actions of Russia in going to war, even though that's obviously not all Russians, is a terrible, terrible thing. But we do that with each other. We do that with ourselves. We decide very quickly that we must separate out the good from the bad, and we look for particular things in making that judgment, or just instinctively make that distinction. One of the things that was very sobering last Wednesday morning, sitting on the bench with Matt, was that we could hear gunfire. Haxby is within earshot of Strensthal Common, and it was evident that early morning, as had been the case the evening before and the day before, there were soldiers on manoeuvres, practicing, rehearsing, being at war. And while the gunfire for us was a crackle in the background, knowing what it was, just sitting there and trying to imagine that morning in any part of Ukraine where the Russian forces had moved in and were beginning to make themselves known in the violence that has ensued. The sound of gunfire would have been quite different. One of the journeys that we go on through Lent is to ask particularly where God can be seen, where God can be expected to be seen. No more so perhaps than in other seasons, but in Lent we ask how we might make room for new ways of encountering God, either through paring back our lives so that there's space for more, or by taking up new activities or a pattern of prayer, of reflection, of even just sitting outside with a cup of tea in the morning and listening to some sparrows, reflecting on thoughts and feelings. This season is about encounter with the intensity of the life of Jesus as he journeys towards Jerusalem. And it is for us again that question, not so much in the idea of God or the way that we are church, but in the experience of encounter with God, where can God be seen? Where can God be expected? I want to read one verse again from this very radical, this audacious, this even shocking passage that Paul writes. Because so much of his writing is so poetic, it's not hard for us to miss some of the way that he shakes the foundations of people's understanding of themselves or of God in the times past, or even as they listen to him in that moment. Verse 18. He talks about, before that, he talks about Moses. He talks about Moses who, in encountering God on Mount Sinai and receiving the Ten Commandments, had his face shine as he came back down to the Israelites. And how they covered that with a veil because they weren't sure what it meant to look on it, because to see God was to die. There is that fascinating little verse which talks about the veil being over his face to keep the people of Israel from gazing at the end of the glory that was being set aside, that fading in Moses. But either way, something frightening in the encounter with God. But Paul writes this: "And all of us, with unveiled faces, seeing the glory of the Lord as though reflected in a mirror, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. For this comes from the Lord, the Spirit." And all of us, with unveiled faces, seeing the glory of the Lord as though reflected in a mirror. Just pause there. We've talked already about the fact that in much of the Old Testament, in the experience of God, in the experience of some of the major prophets, and before that, in the idea of the Holy of Holies within the temple, where the presence of God was most powerfully present alongside the Ark of the Covenant, where only the high priest dared to enter once a year. The language was of seeing God's face and dying. Moses survives, but for Israel or for himself or both, they hide the glory of that. My youngest son Lucas is 7, and we've been reading the first couple of Harry Potter books. And if you know anything about Harry Potter, you know that in the second book there is a creature in the bowels of Hogwarts Castle called a basilisk, a fearsome ancient creature that, if you look at it, if you look directly at it, will kill you. And a number of pupils and other people, even a cat, they are petrified, literally not quite cast in stone, but they are literally frozen in their bodies because they see it. But they don't see it directly. They see it in a reflection, which is one of the things that gets uncovered as you journey through the story. Because they've seen the reflection, it's not deadly. Well, when we talk about Lent and Lenten disciplines, as I've said already, we often talk about giving something up or taking something up, and that can be prayer, discipline, patterns. I wonder, though, if there is a great invitation that is actually almost the whole of the gospel in its foundations for us, that is made particularly real in this passage and might be a really important thing to dwell and spend some time with through the whole of Lent. What if we took verse 18 at face value of 2 Corinthians chapter 3? What if we took that at face value? What if we thought about it as though we were taking off whatever veils we've placed in front of ourselves and looking directly in the mirror? And as Paul reminds us, or invites us, or challenges us, or shocks us into thinking about, as we look into the mirror, seeing the glory of the Lord, seeing the glory of the Lord. What if one of the great challenges for you and I as people of faith, as followers of Jesus, was not to believe in God so much as to dare to believe in God in our own faces? And I'm not saying that you have the face of God, but that God is in your face. God is to be found in your face, in my face. And that maybe if you and I had the courage to look in the mirror as part of our Lenten discipline, not just to see whether our hair's in the right place or not, what if we looked at ourselves, really looked at ourselves, and dared to believe that we're looking into something of the face of God? That's a very powerful thing. It's a very challenging thing. It is much easier to keep God in in ways outside of ourselves. Yeah? To keep God in the church's life, or in holy places, holy people, our history, our experience of being church when we're all together. But there's an enormous intimacy to God's relationship within the Trinity, and in the relationship Jesus has with many individuals through the course of the Gospels, where God comes very close. What if we dared to believe that your face, my face, that our faces bore the face of God? We are a tradition that knows how to be busy and how to do things, how to do good things. But what if the invitation wasn't to jump in first to the doing, but to genuinely spend time with the possibility of God within us, not just God in our actions? That people experience God when they experienced you and I. Now, we have to be careful, because it very quickly can sound or become quite arrogant to say that. I've turned up, so God is here. That's not what I'm suggesting in the slightest. If you know the passage in 2 Corinthians, you'll know that in chapter 4, which follows immediately on, Paul goes on very quickly to talk about this treasure being in jars of clay. He talks about our frailty and our fragility, our humanity, and how that sometimes gets in the way of God. This treasure is not something we hold with great strength, but something we hold in the frailty of our lives, in the smallness of ourselves, in the things we're still becoming. But it's no less true. See, Paul makes the distinction between Moses and ourselves. Moses, whose face had to be covered for himself and for the Israelites, because the face of God was terrifying, or too challenging. I don't know which it is. Paul says, essentially, what if, with unveiled faces, we saw the glory of the Lord as though reflected in a mirror? What if our own images, our own faces, were the image of God? Of course, it goes further than that. The challenge lies even more deeply in the challenge in a time, going back to sitting on the bench with my son, a time when we're very quick to divide ourselves up into who could have the face of God and who couldn't, who might be in possession of God's kingdom as they live out their lives and who definitely isn't. We make those decisions quickly. But what if part of the challenge of Lent as well was to see how the gospel invites us, through the model of the life of Jesus, to look for God's face in the faces of others. And not just the people we like, or the people we love or agree with, or who look or sound or behave like us, have our opinions, speak our language, all of the things that are our biases as well as our judgments. Well, what if I said to you that the face of God was in the face of the person who has wounded you the most, hurt you the most in your life? That the face of God was just as much in those people as in the best people you know? What if I said that the face of God was in the face of those we really struggle to trust or to follow, those who hurt? What if the face of God was in every Russian soldier? What if the face of God was in the face of Vladimir Putin? Now, I'm not suggesting that there is some sentimental, silly, naive, way of understanding his actions. But there is something deeply challenging in the Quaker principle, which is not something that deserves writing in a Hallmark card or putting up on a poster with kittens, but that very deep Quaker principle of the truth that there is something of God in every human being. That the possibility of the face of God must always be on the table for everyone, everywhere, to both find it and to see it. That's challenging. That's hard. It's especially hard when we think about those who've hurt us the most in our lives. And in our churches, we do not know each other's hidden stories of abuse, of betrayal, of broken trust, of the worst that relationship can be. Physically, emotionally, spiritually, we don't know. And so, what if together we were asking how we help each other find the face of God in our healing from those things, as much as in our obvious searching for it in the face of the good people. So I want to leave those thoughts with you for the second Sunday of Lent. Yes, going back in the lectionary a bit, with permission from this Sunday's readings to go back to the Transfiguration, which is a bit of a story about how Peter and the disciples want to root the face of God and the experience of God in a particular moment and place. And Jesus says, come on, let's go down the hill. There's more to do. Beyond the greetings and before the pointing to heaven that are part of the early stages of 2 Corinthians, there is a deep rooting in the here and now. A radical, audacious, shocking rooting of God in the here and now, in the faces and voices of those who hear this letter read and who are part of the early church in Corinth. And to you and I. What if the great task of the gospel was to find the possibility of God's face in our own, and to do the work of looking for it in the faces of others? Even more so, the faces of those who we've probably decided somehow, all of us in some way, can't possibly bear the face of God in our world. So Jesus sees the face of God in those who crucify him. He sees the face of God in the prisoner on the cross next to him. He sees the face of God even in his conversations with Herod, with Pilate. He seems always to make room for the possibility. And I wonder how challenging that is for you and I, as we live in the world we live in right now, and as we ask what it means to be faithful to that Jesus, who asks us into this season in this very particular way. So every blessing as you journey through Lent, on your own or together in conversation, and however this sharing has sparked thoughts, difficulties even for yourself, I pray that those will be fruitful and that God will be in them, and that you will wake up tomorrow morning, look in the mirror, and even dare to believe that God's face is to be seen. Maybe more than ever before, or for the very first time. And then the work begins with those who share our lives. God bless you in that.